Welcome to where modern mysteries meet ancient morals. We don't just tell stories, we reveal the human condition hidden in the dark. From the gritty streets of the city to the whispers of forgotten folklore, we explore the shadows that walk beside us. So take a chair, like, subscribe, and share. Let's dive in.
The humidity in the industrial district of Ilupaju was not merely weather, it was a physical weight, a suffocating, leaden blanket that pressed down on the dreams of the millions scrambling for survival in the chaotic sprawl of Lagos. For Malik Jalingo, sitting in his cramped, dimly lit warehouse surrounded by the smell of oxidizing metal and stagnant drain water, the heat was a constant, mocking reminder of his stagnation. He was 35 years old, a man of sharp intellect and sharper ambition who had graduated with a degree in business administration, yet he was drowning in the mediocrity of a legitimate spare parts business that was slowly bleeding him dry. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that had turned gray from dust, staring blankly at the rows of unsold, rusting alternators and carburetors that represented his entire life savings. He had tried to play by the rules, importing goods through the proper channels, paying the exorbitant customs duties that changed whimsically from week to week, and bribing the endless chain of officials who viewed commerce as their personal feeding trough, but the system was designed to crush men like him. The big men, the tycoons he saw in the society pages of this day newspaper, didn't play by these rules, they wrote them. Malik's resentment had been simmering for years, a slow-cooked poison, but today it had boiled over when the bank manager called to threaten foreclosure on his modest three-bedroom apartment in Festac. It was a humiliation he could not stomach, the thought of his wife, Neka, and their children being put out on the street. He realized then that in a city where morality was often a luxury reserved for the wealthy, being a good man was synonymous with being a victim. He remembered the stories of the old-school armed robbers, brutal, loud, and short-lived, and dismissed them as fools who traded their lives for peanuts. He didn't want to be a bandit, he wanted to be an executive. His mind, always architectural in its thinking, began to deconstruct the economy of crime with a cold, detached precision. Drugs were too risky, involving international cartels and death sentences. Cybercrime was for small boys in internet cafes dealing in pennies. But humans? Humans were the most valuable commodity in Nigeria. The rich would pay anything, liquidate assets, sell properties, empty vaults, to preserve their lineage, their comfort, and their lives. He looked at the rusting metal around him and smiled for the first time in months, not with joy, but with the cold clarity of a predator who had finally spotted prey in the tall grass. He would not just kidnap people, he would industrialize the process, turning the act of abduction into a high-yield business venture. That evening, the transformation from Malik the struggling merchant to the architect began in earnest, not with a gun, but with a notepad and a pen in the silence of his kitchen. He sat at the table, ignoring the sounds of his wife putting their two young children to bed in the next room, and began to draft a business plan that would have impressed a Harvard MBA. He meticulously identified the failures of previous kidnapping gangs. They were impulsive, they held victims in squalid conditions that caused health crises and death, they used traceable phones, and they panicked during negotiations. Malik resolved to be different. He would treat abduction as a premium service where the client, the victim, was a high-value asset to be managed and preserved. He needed a team, but not just any street thugs. He needed professionals who could follow a corporate hierarchy and adhere to a strict code of conduct. He reached out to an old contact from his university days, a hulking, silent man known only as Sunday, or Cobra, to those who feared him on the streets. Sunday had been a political thug, used to breaking legs for ballot boxes during election seasons, but he was currently unemployed and hungry. They met in a noisy, generator-powered bar in Okota, where the loud, rhythmic thumping of Fuji music provided cover for their conversation. Malik laid it out clearly, his voice low and steady. No random snatching, no raping, and absolutely no killing unless authorized by him personally. He explained that dead victims paid no ransoms and brought unnecessary police heat, whereas a living, terrified victim was a check waiting to be cashed. He spoke of overhead costs, logistics, surveillance, and ROI. Sunday listened, mesmerized not just by the promise of millions in cash, but by the sheer audacity and sophistication of Malik's vision. They would not target the struggling middle class who had to borrow to raise ₦1,000,000. They would target the whales, the billionaires who stored their wealth in foreign accounts and crypto wallets. As they clinked their green beer bottles together, a dark pact was sealed in the shadows of the neon lights. Malik Jalingo had officially ceased to exist as a mere civilian. He was now the CEO of a dark enterprise, and the city of Lagos, with all its chaotic energy and hidden wealth, was about to become his personal ATM. The recruitment phase that followed was unlike anything the Lagos underworld had ever seen. It was less of a gang initiation and more of a corporate headhunting strategy executed in the shadows. Malik did not prowl the slums looking for desperate drug addicts or trigger-happy boys. Instead, he sought men with specific, marketable skills who had been discarded by the harsh economy. He recruited a dismissed army sergeant who knew how to handle military-grade weapons and evade checkpoints. He found a brilliant but disgraced electrical engineer capable of disabling car trackers and setting up jammed communication networks. And he hired 2 drivers who knew every back road, pothole, and shortcut from Betagree to Ape. Malik convened his first board meeting in the empty shell of his warehouse, now cleared of the rusting auto parts. He stood before his crew of 6 men, dressed not in the rough attire of a criminal, but in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, projecting an air of authority that demanded immediate respect. He laid down the corporate rules, a set of commandments that were non-negotiable. Rule number 1, anonymity is God. No one was to know his real name, his address, or see his face without a mask during operations. Rule number 2, the victim is an asset. They were to be fed well, given medication if needed, and kept comfortable, because a sick victim complicated negotiations. Rule number 3, patience pays. They would not rush for quick cash but would wait for the families to bleed enough to pay the full premium. The men looked at each other, confused by the lack of bloodlust but compelled by the promise of wealth beyond their wildest dreams. Malik handed them their first retainer fees, thick envelopes of cash just for agreeing to the terms, and in that moment, he bought not just their labor, but their loyalty and their silence. With the team assembled, Malik moved to the second phase of his blueprint, target acquisition and surveillance, a process he approached with the meticulousness of a forensic accountant. He spent weeks driving through the highbrow estates of Amuwo, Odafin, and Festac, observing the patterns of the wealthy. He wasn't looking for the loudest men with the flashiest cars, as they often had more debt than cash. He was looking for the quiet money, the importers and industrialists who moved in silence. He settled on his first target, Chief Eko-Atlantic, a major importer of electronics who was known to carry little security but possessed vast liquidity. Malik didn't just order the snatch. He studied Eko-Atlantic for 3 weeks. He knew the chief's route to his warehouse, the time he left his mistress's apartment on Tuesdays, and the specific slowdown point at a bad patch of road near Apple Junction. He briefed his team with diagrams and maps, assigning specific roles to each man. Cobra was the muscle, the driver was the extraction, and the engineer was the lookout. There was no room for improvisation. The plan was a script that had to be followed to the letter. As the date of the operation approached, the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted from anticipation to a cold, professional focus. Malik warned them that any deviation from the plan would result in immediate termination, and in their line of work, termination was literal. He was building a machine, a perfect engine of extraction, and he was the only one with the key to the ignition. The city slept, unaware that a new predator had evolved, one that didn't hunt with claws, but with a blueprint. The operation began at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, perfectly timed to coincide with the chaotic, gridlocked traffic that defines Lagos evenings. Chief Eko-Atlantic's black Land Cruiser was inching through the congestion near Apple Junction, surrounded by yellow Danfo buses and street hawkers selling everything from gala sausage rolls to cold drinks. It was a scene of utter normalcy until Malik's team initiated the strike. The engineer, driving a battered sedan, intentionally clipped the rear bumper of the chief's SUV. It was a minor collision, just enough to annoy the driver and force him to step out to inspect the damage. The moment the driver's door opened, the trap snapped shut with terrifying speed. Cobra and 2 other operatives, wearing tactical vests and balaclavas, emerged from a van 3 cars back. They didn't scream or fire shots into the air like common robbers. They moved with the silent, fluid efficiency of a SWAT team. In less than 30 seconds, the chief's driver was subdued with a taser, and Chief Eko-Atlantic was shoved into the back of the waiting van, sandwiched between 2 armed men who told him calmly that silence was the only thing that would keep him alive. The other commuters, paralyzed by shock and the sight of assault rifles, did nothing. By the time the police siren wailed in the distance, the van had already melted into the labyrinth of side streets, vanishing into the darkness of the city. Malik, watching from a safe distance in his own unmarked car, felt a surge of adrenaline that was colder and more potent than any drug. The extraction was flawless. There was no blood on the upholstery, no stray bullets in bystanders, just a clean removal of the asset from the general population. The second half of the harvest took place 3 days later, in the psychological torture chamber of the negotiation. Malik did not call the family immediately. He let them stew in their own panic for 72 hours, letting the silence amplify their terror. When he finally dialed the number of the chief's wife, he used a burner phone with a voice modulator that deepened his tone to a gravelly, metallic baritone. He did not scream threats or demand the impossible. He spoke like a banker discussing a mortgage. "Madam," he said, "your husband is safe. He is eating well. But his accommodation is expensive." He demanded $200,000, not naira, but dollars. The wife wept, pleading that they didn't have that kind of liquidity, that the banks were closed, that the EFCC monitored large withdrawals. Malik listened patiently, then calmly explained that he knew about their 3 accounts in Dubai and the property in Lekki. The precision of his knowledge shattered her defenses. He was not guessing. He knew their net worth better than they did. He instructed her on how to convert the cash through black market changers in the trade fair complex, breaking the sum into smaller transactions to avoid detection. "Do not involve the police," he warned, his voice devoid of anger. "If I see a uniform, the contract is cancelled and the asset is liquidated." The negotiation was a masterclass in leverage. By the time he hung up, the wife was not thinking about catching the kidnappers. She was solely focused on gathering the money to pay for the service of her husband's life. Malik sat back in his chair, knowing the harvest was secure. He had turned fear into a currency, and the exchange rate was entirely in his favor. The handover of the ransom was executed with the complexity of a spy novel, designed to ensure that even if the police were watching, they would be chasing shadows. Malik directed the chief's brother, who was delivering the money, on a maddening tour of the city. He sent him from a bustling market in Alaba to a quiet church in Suralere, and finally to a desolate stretch of road along the Baydagri Expressway. At the final drop zone, under the cover of a pitch-black night, the bag containing the $200,000 was tossed into a drainage ditch as instructed, where one of Malik's runners, disguised as a scavenger, retrieved it seconds later. When the cash was finally brought to the warehouse and dumped onto the table, the room fell silent. The stacks of fresh, crisp $100 bills carried a distinct smell, a mix of ink, paper, and the sweat of desperation. For the crew, it was more money than they had seen in 10 lifetimes. For Malik, it was validation. He split the money according to the agreed percentages, taking the lion's share as the architect of the scheme. He didn't hoard it like a miser. He understood that money was a tool for transformation. True to his word, Chief Eko-Atlantic was released that same night, dropped off on a quiet street in Festac with transport fare in his pocket, unharmed but psychologically scarred forever. Malik watched the news the next morning, sipping tea as the media reported the miraculous return of the chief, with no mention of the ransom paid. The silence of the victim was the receipt of the transaction. With his share of the loot, Malik began the meticulous construction of his double life. He didn't go out and buy a flashy Lamborghini that would attract attention. Instead, he invested in legitimacy. He paid off his bank debts, clearing the foreclosure threat on his home, and injected capital into his spare parts business to make it look like it was suddenly thriving. But his true ambition lay elsewhere. He purchased a plot of land in Magodo Phase 2, a prestigious area on the mainland, intending to build a house that signaled his arrival into the upper class. A week later, he took Nneka and the children on an impromptu vacation to Ghana. As they sat by the pool at a five-star resort in Accra, sipping cocktails while his children splashed happily in the turquoise water, Malik felt a profound sense of dissociation. He looked at his hands, expecting to see stains, but they were manicured and clean. He bought his daughter a giant ice cream sundae, smiling as she hugged him, calling him the best daddy in the world. Nneka, glowing with the relief of their financial turnaround, asked no deep questions. She accepted his vague explanation of a big supply contract with the government. Why would she question the source of the comfort she so desperately wanted? Malik realized that money washed away sins. He told himself that he was doing this for them, that the terror he inflicted on another family was the price for the happiness of his own. He was a provider, a protector, and if the world had to bleed to keep his family afloat, then let it bleed. 6 months later, the architect's operation had evolved from a startup into a formidable institution, leaving the Lagos State Police Command chasing a phantom they couldn't comprehend. The media had dubbed the gang leader the Ghost of Eko, a moniker that fed Malik's growing ego. The police were used to tracking phone signals to shanties and raiding uncompleted buildings in the bush, but Malik had completely revolutionized the logistics of confinement. He realized that keeping victims in remote locations was dangerous because strangers stood out in villages. Instead, he adopted the philosophy of hiding in plain sight. With the proceeds from 3 successful kidnappings, Malik rented 2 duplexes in quiet, upscale residential estates, one in Jakande and another in Amuwo. These were gated communities with security guards, paved roads, and neighbors who drove Mercedes-Benzes. He furnished the houses with expensive curtains and furniture, paying the rent 2 years in advance to avoid landlord inspections. To the outside world, he was just another businessman who traveled often. In reality, these houses were high-end prisons. He installed soundproof padding in the guest rooms, disguised behind heavy velvet drapes, and fitted the windows with internal burglary proofs that were impossible to breach. The genius of the safe house strategy was its audacity. While police helicopters scanned the forests of Ikorodu for victims, the captives were sitting in air-conditioned rooms in the middle of the city, watching cable TV, albeit with their legs chained to the floor. Malik would drive into the estate in his SUV, wave politely to the security guards who opened the gate for him with a salute, and park in his garage. He would then walk into the house, remove his designer jacket, and descend into the role of the jailer. He ensured the victims were fed fast food from legitimate eateries, Mr. Big's, Chicken Republic, so that no suspicion arose from bulk cooking. The neighbors, consumed by their own lives and the high fences that separated the houses, saw nothing. They saw a quiet man who occasionally visited his property. They didn't hear the weeping behind the soundproof walls. They didn't know that the tenant was a monster. Malik reveled in this duality. He felt like a god walking among mortals, possessing a secret knowledge that elevated him above the law. He was no longer just reacting to the economy, he was dominating it. His empire was built on the silence of the suburbs, and the walls of his safe houses were the foundation of his rapidly growing fortune. He was untouchable, or so he believed, as he stood on the balcony of his prison house, smoking a cigar and watching the sunset over the city he held hostage. As the Nigerian economy began to wobble under the weight of inflation and fluctuating oil prices, Malik, the architect, Jalingo realized that his business model needed to pivot from a local operation to an international enterprise. He gathered his inner circle in the basement of a new safe house in Igando, a location chosen for its dense population and lack of police surveillance, to explain the new economic reality. The naira was too volatile. Holding millions in local currency was a losing game as its value evaporated daily. Malik introduced a new policy that would fundamentally change the kidnapping landscape in Lagos. Ransoms would no longer be accepted in cash alone. He demanded payment in United States dollars, euros, or, for the more tech-savvy families, Bitcoin. This shift required a level of sophistication that baffled the local authorities. Malik set up a network of bureau de change operators in the shadows of the trade fairs, men who were not officially licensed but moved millions of dollars daily through the Hawala system. He instructed families on how to transfer funds to offshore accounts in Ghana and South Africa, using shell companies he had registered under the guise of textile importation. The logistics of moving the victims also evolved. The days of throwing people into the trunks of cars were over. That was for amateurs. Malik purchased 2 second-hand ambulances and branded them with the logos of a defunct private hospital. In the notorious Lagos traffic, where gridlock could last for hours, an ambulance with a siren was the only vehicle with the authority to cut through the chaos. He moved his high-value captives in broad daylight, sedated on stretchers, while police officers at checkpoints waved them through, saluting the medical personnel who were actually transporting human cargo worth millions of dollars. The supply side of his business was booming, but Malik was meticulous about managing the demand. He understood that if he kidnapped too many people at once, the heat would become unbearable, so he artificially limited the supply to keep the market price high. He targeted only the super whales, oil magnates, telecommunications executives, and expatriate contractors. To facilitate these high-stakes abductions, he expanded his network of informants to include domestic staff, drivers, cooks, and gatekeepers who felt underpaid and invisible. He realized that the rich were often betrayed by the very people who served them their meals. One such informant, a driver for a Turkish construction magnate, provided the exact GPS route and timing of his boss's weekly visit to a site in Ape. The operation was executed with military precision using the ambulance strategy. The victim was intercepted, sedated, and hospitalized in one of Malik's executive safe houses within 2 hours. When the ransom demand came, it was for $1 million in cryptocurrency. The family, terrified and advised by security consultants who recognized the professionalism of the gang, paid within a week. Malik watched the digital numbers swell in his encrypted wallet, sitting in his study in Eko-Atlantic, realizing he had achieved the ultimate capitalist dream. He had divorced the revenue from the risk of physical cash handling. He was no longer just a kidnapper, he was a fintech criminal. The psychological bifurcation of Malik Jalingo was a feat of mental endurance that would have shattered a lesser man. On a humid Saturday morning, he stood on the manicured sidelines of a soccer field at an elite private school in Lekki, cheering for his son, Junior, who was playing as a striker. Surrounded by other wealthy parents, judges, politicians, and CEOs, Malik played the role of the doting father to perfection. He wore a white linen shirt and designer sunglasses, exchanging pleasantries about the rising cost of school fees and the poor state of the roads. To these people, he was Mr. Jalingo, the successful auto parts importer who was generous with his donations to the school's building fund. He laughed at their jokes and shared their anxieties about the security situation in the country, nodding sympathetically when a woman complained about the kidnapping epidemic terrorizing the mainland. The irony did not escape him. It fueled him. He felt a perverse sense of power knowing that he was the very monster they feared, standing right in their midst, sharing their bottled water. He looked at his wife, Neka, who was chatting happily with the wife of a bank director, and felt a surge of protective pride. He told himself that everything he did, every terrified scream he ignored, every life he leveraged, was to keep her in this circle, insulated from the harsh realities of the Nigeria he had grown up in. He was the dam holding back the floodwaters of poverty, and if the dam was built on bones, so be it. However, the strain of the mask began to show in the quiet moments. Later that evening, while the family sat down for dinner, Malik's secure burner phone vibrated in his pocket, a specific pattern that signaled an emergency at the safe house. The transition was instant and terrifyingly cold. One moment he was cutting a piece of chicken for his daughter, asking about her homework. The next, his eyes went dead, void of all warmth. "I have to take this. It's a supplier from China," he lied, his voice steady but lacking its usual cadence. He walked into his home office and locked the door. The call was from Cobra. A victim was having a hypertensive crisis and they needed insulin. Malik didn't panic about the man's life, he panicked about the asset depreciating. He barked orders with the ferocity of a general, coordinating a medical drop with a corrupt pharmacist on his payroll. When he returned to the dinner table 5 minutes later, the mask was back in place, but it felt heavier. Neka looked at him, sensing a darkness she couldn't name, a shadow that seemed to linger around him even in the brightness of their chandelier-lit dining room. "Is everything okay, honey?" she asked. Malik smiled, a practiced, hollow expression. Business as usual, my dear. Just supply chain issues. He took a sip of wine, the taste of blood money lingering at the back of his throat, wondering how long he could keep the two halves of his soul from tearing him apart. Every chain has a link that corrodes faster than the others, and for Malik's organization, that link was Sunday, known as Cobra. While Malik was disciplined, investing his share of the ransoms into real estate and legitimate businesses to wash the money, Cobra was a creature of immediate gratification. He spent his earnings on loud parties, women, and drugs, drawing unnecessary attention to himself in the slums of Ajij where he still spent his time. The money burned a hole in his pocket, and when Malik announced a cooling-off period of 2 months to let the police heat die down after a high-profile snatch, Cobra grew restless and broke. Greed whispered to him that he didn't need the architect to pull off a job. He had the muscle, he had the guns, and he knew the game. Without Malik's authorization, Cobra recruited 2 low-level street touts and organized a snatch of a local supermarket owner. It was a disaster from the start. They didn't scout the location properly, they used a car with a registered plate, and they panicked when the man resisted, pistol whipping him in broad daylight before speeding off. The ransom demand was sloppy, a measly 5 million naira asked over an unencrypted line. Malik found out not from Cobra, but from the news. His network of informants buzzed with the rumor that Cobra's boys had done a messy job. Malik's rage was not hot, it was glacial. He understood that a rogue element was a cancer that would kill the entire organism if not excised or aggressively treated. He summoned Cobra to a meeting at an abandoned construction site in the Abejaleki axis at midnight. Cobra arrived expecting a lecture, perhaps a fine, but he found Malik sitting on a pile of concrete blocks, flanked by the rest of the core team who held their weapons loosely but with clear intent. Malik didn't raise his voice. He asked Cobra to explain the concept of risk versus reward. When Cobra stammered, blaming his financial needs, Malik stood up and delivered a lesson in leadership that was brutal and physical. He ordered the other men to restrain Cobra. Malik didn't kill him. Cobra was too valuable a muscle to lose yet, and loyalty was hard to find, but he inflicted a punishment designed to be unforgettable. He took Cobra's share of the next 3 jobs and ordered a severe physical beating, watching dispassionately as his second-in-command was humbled in the dust. "You are the hand, I am the head," Malik whispered to the bleeding man. "The hand does not move unless the head commands. If you move on your own again, I will cut you off." Cobra nodded, spitting blood, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and a newfound, deep-seated resentment. Malik had restored order, but he had also created an enemy within his own camp, a man who now obeyed out of fear rather than loyalty. The infallibility of Malik's system was finally tested on a rainy Tuesday night in November. The target was Chief Pius, a retired military colonel who had transitioned into oil servicing. Malik's scouts had reported that the colonel traveled with only 1 driver, but they had failed to account for the man's military training and his paranoia. As the team moved to intercept his vehicle on the bridge connecting the mainland to the island, the operation unraveled. The moment the ambulance blocked the road, the colonel didn't freeze, he reacted. He rammed his armored SUV into the blockers and drew a service pistol he kept under his seat. A chaotic firefight erupted in the pouring rain. Cobra and the team were caught off guard. They were used to terrified civilians, not a combat veteran returning fire with lethal accuracy. One of Malik's new drivers was shot in the shoulder, screaming in agony, and the colonel managed to reverse his vehicle and speed away, his windshield shattered but his life intact. The team fled the scene, dragging their wounded comrade into the van, leaving behind shattered glass and shell casings, forensic goldmines for the police. Back at the safe house, the atmosphere was one of terrified silence. Malik arrived to find a scene of carnage and panic. The mission was a total failure. No asset, a wounded man, and a police report that would certainly include descriptions of their vehicle. Malik looked at the bleeding driver, a young boy named Emeka who was wailing that he needed a hospital. Malik knew that taking a gunshot victim to any hospital in Lagos would trigger a mandatory police report. He was faced with the coldest equation of his career. The boy was a liability. He could be traced, he could talk, and he was currently endangering the safety of the entire unit. Malik ordered everyone out of the room except for Cobra. He looked at the boy, who was pleading with his eyes, clutching Malik's hand. "I will take care of you," Malik said softly, his voice soothing. He lied. He signaled to Cobra. They could not risk a doctor. They treated the wound with basic first aid and heavy sedatives, keeping the boy in the safe house basement. But as the infection set in days later and the boy became delirious, Malik made the executive decision to cut the loss. The boy disappeared in the night, his body disposed of in the lagoon. Malik told the crew he had been sent to a private clinic in Benin Republic. The lie held, but the stench of death lingered in the house. It was the first time Malik had authorized the death of one of his own, and it marked a turning point where his preservation became more important than his humanity. Success is a heady wine, and after 2 years of operating with impunity, Malik was drunk on it. The memory of the botched job faded as 3 subsequent operations went off flawlessly, netting the gang over $2 million in crypto and cash. Malik began to believe the mythology he had created, that he was a ghost, a spirit that the law could not touch. The caution that had defined his early days began to erode, replaced by a reckless need to display his dominance. He purchased a limited edition Patek Philippe watch worth $50,000, wearing it openly to social events where police commissioners were present. He bought a mansion in Ghana under a pseudonym but flew there almost every weekend on first-class flights, leaving a trail of digital footprints he previously would have avoided. His arrogance seeped into his interactions with the authorities. When the police announced a manhunt for the kingpin, Malik anonymously called the radio station that was broadcasting the press conference. Using his voice modulator, he didn't negotiate, he taunted. "Tell the commissioner to fix his patrol cars before he tries to catch a phantom," he said on air, sending a chill through the city. This hubris culminated in his 40th birthday party, a lavish affair held at a private event center in Victoria Island. He invited the crème de la crème of Lagos society. Champagne flowed like water, and Malik stood at the center of it all, dressed in a white agbada with gold embroidery, toasting to prosperity and peace of mind. He looked around the room and felt like a god. He had hacked the system of life. He had taken the unfairness of Nigeria and bent it to his will. He saw the police patrols outside, paid to provide security for his party, guarding the very man they were hunting. The irony was delicious. He pulled Nneka close on the dance floor, whispering promises of a future in Europe, of a retirement where they would be royalty. He didn't see the cracks forming in the foundation of his tower. He didn't see that his taunts had embarrassed the wrong people, that his wealth was attracting envious eyes, and that the higher he climbed, the more visible he became to the hunter who was just stepping out of the shadows. Malik, the architect, thought he had built a fortress, but in his arrogance, he had built a cage. Assistant Commissioner of Police Tunde Balogun was a man who seemed to exist in grayscale amidst the vibrant, chaotic color of Lagos. His office at the Intelligence Response Team headquarters in Ikeja was a testament to his obsession. Stacks of dusty case files formed unstable towers on his desk, and a whiteboard covered in scribbles and string dominated the peeling yellow wall. Balogun was not a man of brute force. He did not carry a golden gun or drive a flashy car. He drove a battered Toyota Corolla and wore ill-fitting suits, but behind his wire-rimmed glasses lay a mind that operated with the precision of a supercomputer. He had been brought in from Abuja specifically to address the epidemic of the invisible, a series of high-profile kidnappings where the victims vanished without a trace and returned weeks later, silent and traumatized, with millions of dollars missing from the economy. While the regular police force chased street thugs and harassed bus drivers, Balogun sat in the silence of his office, analyzing the cold files. He wasn't looking for fingerprints, he was looking for a philosophy. He noticed the pattern that everyone else had missed: the absence of violence in the initial snatch, the use of sophisticated encryption for ransom demands, and the eerie comfort reported by the few victims willing to speak. They spoke of air conditioning, of 3-course meals, and of a chairman who spoke like a university professor. Balogun realized with a chilling certainty that he wasn't hunting a gang leader, he was hunting a CEO. The criminal landscape of Nigeria had evolved, and the police were fighting a digital war with analog tools. He swept the files off his desk in a rare moment of frustration, deciding then and there to build a new kind of unit, a team of hackers, data analysts, and trackers who could hunt a ghost in the machine. Balogun's first move was to revisit the scenes of the releases, not the abductions. He drove to the lonely stretch of road in Festac where Chief Ugachukwu had been dropped off years ago. He walked the tarmac, closing his eyes, trying to reconstruct the timeline. He interviewed the chief again, not as a police officer, but as a therapist, coaxing out sensory details that the victim had suppressed. The chief mentioned a specific detail. During his captivity, in the dead of night, he would hear the faint, rhythmic chugging of a heavy-duty diesel generator, distinct from the high-pitched whine of the smaller, "I better pass my neighbor" generators common in the slums. He also recalled the muffled sound of a church choir practicing on Wednesday evenings. Balogun pinned these details to his mental map. The kidnapper wasn't hiding in the bush. He was hiding in a residential estate wealthy enough to afford industrial power but close enough to a church to hear the hymns. This was the breakthrough. The ghost of Eko was a neighbor. Balogun returned to his team with a new directive. They would not look for criminals hiding in the shadows. They would look for a rich man hiding in the light. He ordered a geofencing analysis of all active cell towers in highbrow residential areas, looking for anomalies. The hunter had entered the forest, and for the first time, the predator was being tracked. The crack in Malik's armor did not come from a grand police raid or a betrayal by a lieutenant. It came from a moment of sentimental complacency, the kind of human error that technology punishes without mercy. Malik possessed over 126 SIM cards, a rotating inventory of digital masks that he used to coordinate his empire. His protocol was strict. A SIM card used for a ransom negotiation was to be destroyed immediately after the call, snapped in half and flushed down the toilet. However, one specific SIM card, a registered line he had used years ago to court Nneka before they were married, held a sentimental value he couldn't quite discard. It was stored in a small, velvet pouch in his safe, a relic of the man he used to be. On a restless Tuesday night, while his wife slept and the paranoia of his retirement job weighed on him, Malik inserted this old SIM into a brand new, unregistered iPhone 12. He didn't make a call. He simply turned it on to read old text messages, a nostalgic trip to a simpler time. He left the phone on for exactly 4 minutes before realizing his breach of protocol and powering it down. He told himself it didn't matter, he hadn't called anyone. But he had forgotten the fundamental rule of telecommunications, the handshake. The moment the phone connected to the network, it pinged the nearest cell tower in Magodo Phase 2, broadcasting its IMEI number, the unique fingerprint of the device itself. Across the city, in the air-conditioned hum of the IRT technical room, a red flag appeared on a monitor. Balogun's team had been running a tower dump algorithm, analyzing millions of connection logs for devices that had been associated with known criminal activity. The IMEI of Malik's new iPhone had been flagged because it had been briefly active near the site of a previous abduction during a scouting run. The system now linked that dirty device to a clean SIM card registered to a name, Malik Jalingo. It was a tenuous link, a digital whisper, but for Balogun, it was a thunderclap. He stared at the screen, tracing the triangulation lines. The signal came from an exclusive estate in Magodo, a fortress of the wealthy. Balogun didn't celebrate. He froze, his mind racing. Malik Jalingo, he whispered, tasting the name. He typed it into the database. A legitimate businessman. A philanthropist. A family man. The profile was perfect, too perfect. Balogun ordered a cloning of the number, allowing the police to listen to any future calls and track the phone's location in real time. He also ordered a background check on Malik's assets. The digital breadcrumbs were leading them to a castle, and the ghost finally had a face. While the digital net tightened, the human element of Malik's organization began to fray at the edges. Sunday, the fearsome cobra, had grown increasingly careless, outsourcing his menial tasks to street urchins to avoid exposure. One of these errands boys, a scrawny teenager known as Small, was arrested by a patrol team in Ajij for a petty crime, stealing a woman's handbag in the market. It was a routine arrest that should have ended with a bail payment and a release, but Small, terrified of the cell and eager to impress the other inmates, began to boast. He bragged about his connection to Baba Cobra, a big man who drove ambulances and controlled millions of dollars. The divisional police officer, a sharp-witted woman who had received Balogun's memo about intelligence gathering, caught wind of the chatter. She didn't dismiss it as jailhouse bluster. She flagged the name Cobra and contacted the IRT. Within hours, Balogun was sitting in the interrogation room, facing the trembling teenager. Balogun didn't shout. He brought the boy a meat pie and a cold bottle of Coke. He played the role of the benevolent uncle, asking about the boy's mother and his future. Under the influence of the food and Balogun's terrifyingly calm demeanor, Small cracked. He revealed that he didn't know the big boss, but he knew where Cobra hung out, a specific viewing center in the slums where he bet on Premier League matches every Saturday. He also mentioned that Cobra had been complaining about a final job that would set them all up for life, a job involving a chief with plenty medicine. Balogun pieced the puzzle together instantly. The medicine reference pointed to a pharmaceutical tycoon. The final job meant the gang was preparing to strike soon. Balogun now had a tangible lead on the ground. He didn't arrest Cobra immediately, that would spook the architect. Instead, he turned Small into a human surveillance drone. He released the boy with a tracker in his pocket and a promise of immunity, instructing him to go back to Cobra and keep his ears open. The police now had an inside man, a pair of eyes within the perimeter of the gang's operation. The hunter was no longer just watching from the outside, he was inside the house. Malik Jalingo sat in his study, the blueprint of his magnum opus spread out before him. The target was Chief Odogwu, the billionaire CEO of a multinational pharmaceutical company. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a retirement plan. The ransom was set at $2 million, a sum that would allow Malik to liquidate his assets in Nigeria, buy citizenship in a Caribbean nation, and vanish into the global elite with his family. But the pressure was mounting. The economy was crashing, meaning he needed more cash to convert to foreign currency, and Nneka was asking dangerous questions. She had found a receipt for diesel in the glove compartment of his car, diesel purchased in a part of town where they had no business. She had confronted him the night before, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion, asking if he was having an affair. Malik had laughed it off, gaslighting her with expensive jewelry, but he knew the clock was ticking. He couldn't sustain the double life much longer. His children were growing up. They were starting to notice his erratic hours and the strange men who sometimes came to the gate. The planning for the Odogwu job was obsessive. Malik had spent 3 months studying the chief's routine. He knew that the chief traveled with a convoy of 2 cars, a decoy vehicle and his armored Lexus. He knew the chief's security detail consisted of mobile police officers who were often tired and underpaid. Malik decided that this operation would require a level of violence he usually avoided. He couldn't risk a standoff. He instructed his team to upgrade their arsenal. They acquired AK-47s with double-taped magazines and, for the first time, a rocket-propelled grenade launcher as a deterrent. The corporate rules of non-violence were suspended. This was a smash and grab. He gathered the team, including a sullen Cobra, and laid out the stakes. "This is the last one," he told them, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "After this, we are all kings. But if anyone messes up, there is no second chance. We take the chief, we get the money, and we disappear." The air in the room was thick with the metallic scent of gun oil and fear. They were crossing a line from professional criminals to domestic terrorists, and there was no turning back. The ambush took place on the bustling Osborne Road in Ikoyi, a location chosen for its proximity to the bridge, offering a quick escape route to the mainland. It was 8 p.m., and the traffic was moving in a sluggish, bumper-to-bumper rhythm. Chief Odogwu's convoy was boxed in. Malik, watching from a distance in a command vehicle, gave the signal. The operation began with a deafening explosion, not the RPG, but a shaped charge used to blow the tires of the police escort vehicle. Chaos erupted instantly. Commuters screamed and abandoned their cars as Malik's men, dressed in full tactical gear, swarmed the chief's Lexus. The police escorts, disoriented and outgunned, tried to return fire, but they were suppressed by a hail of bullets from Cobra's assault rifle. It was a scene of war in the middle of a metropolis. The armored glass of the Lexus held for a few seconds before the team used sledgehammers to shatter the driver's side window. They dragged the screaming Chief Odogwu out of the car, throwing him into the back of a waiting Sienna van that had been disguised as a delivery vehicle. The entire extraction took less than 3 minutes, but it left a trail of destruction, burning cars, injured officers, and a city plunged into panic. However, the escape did not go as smoothly as planned. ACP Balogun, acting on the intelligence from Small and the tracking data, was less than 5 minutes away. As Malik's convoy sped toward the third mainland bridge, sirens began to wail from all directions. Balogun had locked down the island. Malik, listening to the police radio frequency, realized the trap was closing. He made a split-second decision that saved them but doomed his anonymity. He ordered the team to abandon the planned route and switch vehicles in a darker, secondary location under the bridge. They transferred the hostage into the ambulance, leaving the Sienna behind. As they sped away, blending into the traffic with the siren of the ambulance wailing, Balogun arrived at the switch point. He found the abandoned Sienna still warm. Inside, on the floor mat, was a distinctive, gold-plated lighter that had fallen from Cobra's pocket in the scramble. Balogun picked it up, his face grim. They had missed them by seconds. But as he looked at the chaos around him, he knew the game had changed. Malik had escalated the war, and in doing so, he had left a physical trail. The ghost was no longer a myth. He was a fleeing fugitive with a hostage, and the entire weight of the Nigerian state was about to crash down on him. The safe house in Igando, once a fortress of anonymity, had transformed into a claustrophobic tomb. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, unwashed bodies, and the acrid scent of fear. Chief Odogwu, the Billionaire asset, sat blindfolded and chained in the corner of the soundproofed room, his spirit broken by days of darkness, unaware that the very city outside was being torn apart to find him. Malik stood by the window, peering through a crack in the heavy velvet curtains, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The kidnapping had been successful in its execution, but the aftermath was a disaster. The police response was not the usual disorganized scramble, it was a coordinated, digital siege. Malik's burner phones, usually his lifeline to the outside world, now felt like tracking devices burning a hole in his pocket. He had turned them all off, severing communication with the family for the ransom negotiation, a move that went against every rule in his corporate handbook. Silence usually induced panic in the families, but this time, the silence was terrifying him. He knew that ACP Balogun's team was not just looking for a car, they were combing the electromagnetic spectrum, sifting through terabytes of data to find the digital footprint of the ambulance that had vanished under the bridge. The generator hummed outside, a monotonous drone that usually signaled power and comfort, but now sounded like a countdown. Malik looked at his crew, men who had once looked at him with awe, and saw only restless predators sensing the weakness of their alpha. They were trapped in a standoff with an invisible enemy, and the walls of the safe house, bought with blood money to keep the world out, were now keeping them in. 3 miles away, in the mobile command unit parked discreetly inside a police barracks, ACP Tunde Balogun was staring at a monitor that displayed a heat map of cellular activity. The breakthrough had come from the cloned SIM card Malik had foolishly activated days earlier. Although the phone was off, the network had logged its last known handshake with a tower in the Igando axis. Balogun combined this data with the sighting of the ambulance on a CCTV camera near the Alamosho General Hospital. He wasn't looking for a needle in a haystack anymore, he was burning the haystack down. He had ordered a silent cordon of the entire district. Undercover officers posed as street hawkers selling gala and soft drinks, walking down every street, scanning for the specific license plate of the ambulance or the Sienna van. It was a game of patience, a tightening noose. Balogun knew that criminals, no matter how sophisticated, eventually needed to move, to get food, to get fuel, or to flee. He spoke into his radio, his voice calm and devoid of the adrenaline that coursed through his veins. "Hold the perimeter," he commanded. "No sirens. No lights. We wait for them to blink." He was starving the rat out of the hole. The siege was not physical yet, it was psychological warfare, and Balogun knew that Malik, a man used to controlling every variable, would eventually crack under the pressure of the unknown. By the fourth day of the siege, the unity of the corporate gang had disintegrated into a toxic soup of suspicion and paranoia. Malik sat in the living room of the safe house, his designer shirt rumpled and stained with sweat, a pistol resting on the coffee table, not for the police, but for his own men. He had caught Cobra whispering to the driver in the kitchen, their eyes darting toward him before looking away guiltily. Malik's mind, once a steel trap of logic, was now consumed by conspiracy theories. He convinced himself that Cobra was planning to kill him, take the ransom, and cut a deal with the police. The logic of self-preservation, the very core of his criminal philosophy, dictated that he had to strike first. He formulated a plan to abandon the crew. He had a hidden stash of cash and a Ghanaian passport in a locker at the gym in his estate. If he could slip out tonight, leaving the men to guard the hostage, he could be across the border to Cotonou by dawn. He looked at his loyal lieutenant, the man he had beaten and humiliated, and saw not a partner, but a liability. Malik stood up, feigning a sudden confidence. "I need to go to the main house," he lied, his voice cracking slightly. "I need to get the satellite phone to call the chief's wife. The cellular network is compromised." It was a flimsy excuse, but the desperation in the room was so thick that the men wanted to believe him. They wanted a solution, and the architect was the only one who ever had plans. However, as Malik moved toward the door, the atmosphere shifted. Cobra stepped in his path, his massive frame blocking the exit. The respect was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, feral understanding. "The satellite phone is here, boss," Cobra said, pointing to a duffel bag in the corner. "You brought it yourself yesterday." The lie hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Malik froze. He realized that the hierarchy had inverted. He was no longer the captor of Chief Odogwu alone. He was now a hostage of his own creation. He tried to laugh it off, to channel the charming businessman persona that had fooled high society for years, but his hands were shaking. "Of course, Sunday. I needed fresh air to think." Cobra didn't move. "We think together now," he grunted. At that moment, Malik realized the true cost of his empire. He had built a pedestal on fear and money, but without those currencies, he was nothing but a man in a room with wolves. He retreated to the bedroom, locking the door, and dialed his wife's number on the forbidden burner phone, his fingers trembling. "Neka," he whispered when she answered, "pack the bags. Just the essentials. We are leaving for Accra tonight." He didn't hear her confusion, he only heard the sound of his own empire collapsing around him. The end of the organization began not with Malik, but with the man he had underestimated, Cobra. Realizing that the ship was sinking and that Malik intended to leave them to drown, Cobra made a desperate move for self-preservation. Under the cover of darkness, while Malik was barricaded in the bedroom, Cobra slipped out of the safe house's back gate. He wasn't trying to save the boss, he was trying to save himself. He ditched his phone and flagged down a commercial motorcycle, intending to disappear into the chaotic slums of Ajigunle where the police feared to tread. But he had forgotten the inside man. Small, the teenager Balogun had turned into an informant, had been loitering near the area, driven by the promise of immunity. He spotted the hulking figure of Cobra leaving the target zone and immediately alerted the control room. Balogun's response was swift and silent. Two unmarked vehicles intercepted the motorcycle less than a mile from the safe house. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase. Cobra, a man who had terrorized billionaires, was tackled into a gutter by 4 tactical officers before he could even reach for his weapon. He was handcuffed, hooded, and thrown into the back of a van, the general of the underworld reduced to a common criminal in the dirt. The interrogation was unlike anything Cobra expected. He anticipated torture, beatings, the usual police brutality. Instead, Balogun sat across from him in the mobile unit, holding a file. He showed Cobra the transcripts of Malik's text messages to his wife, messages that the police had intercepted thanks to the clone SIM. "He was leaving you Sunday," Balogun said softly, showing him the text, "Pack the bags. We leave tonight. He was going to Ghana to drink champagne while you and the boys rotted in Kirikiri maximum security prison." The revelation broke something inside Cobra. The loyalty he had clung to, the fear that had kept him in check, dissolved into pure, white-hot rage. He realized he had been nothing more than a tool, a discarded spare part in Malik's machine. Tears of anger mixed with the dirt on his face. "Magodo," Cobra spat out, his voice a growl of betrayal. "He lives in Magodo Phase 2. Frederick Chaluba Street. The house with the gold gate." He gave them everything, the safe house location in Igando where the victim was, and the personal fortress where the King of Shadows slept. Balogun stood up, buttoned his jacket, and radioed the strike teams. "We have the address. Divide the force. Team A takes the safe house and secures the hostage. Team B follows me to Magodo. We are going to wake the king." The raid on Malik's mansion in Magodo Phase 2 was a surreal collision of two worlds. It was 4 a.m., the hour of the wolf, when the city was at its quietest. The estate was silent, the streetlights reflecting off the polished hoods of luxury cars parked in driveways. A convoy of 10 tactical vehicles, lights off, rolled silently down Frederick Chaluba Street. They didn't look like police cars. They looked like shadows moving in the dark. ACP Balogun signaled the breach team. There was no doorbell, no polite knock. The heavy, gold-plated gate that Malik had installed as a symbol of his status was breached with hydraulic cutters that sheared through the metal like paper. The operatives, dressed in black combat gear with night vision goggles, poured into the compound, moving past the manicured lawn and the swimming pool where Malik's children played. Inside the master bedroom, Malik was awake, staring at the ceiling, his packed suitcases by the door. He heard the crunch of metal and the heavy thud of boots on marble. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't try to fight. The architect simply froze. The facade of the powerful criminal mastermind crumbled instantly, leaving behind a terrified, middle-aged man in designer's silk pajamas. When the bedroom door was kicked open, the beam of tactical flashlights blinded him. "Police! Get on the ground! Now!" The commands were shouted with the force of a thunderclap.
Thank you for
Neka
watching.
screamed, pulling the duvet over
Like
herself,
and subscribe for
eyes
more.
wide with